The University of Bonn, 2018. A German paleontologist meets with our colleagues as an extraordinary find from the Swiss Alps is being passed around. The treasure is an enormous root fragment of a tooth the size of an exhaust pipe, over 5 centimeters in diameter. The paleontologist realizes the sheer power of this animal, a formidable macropredator, and calculates a rough estimate of its size, with its mass rivaling that of the greatest known predators to ever exist. Only a handful of people will even know of the beast's existence until its publication 4 years later. And now, for the first time, this gigantic predator's true size is revealed to the public. As of the time of this video's writing, the 2 largest confirmed apex predators in history were Otodus megalodon, a giant whale-eating shark, and Livyatan melville, a giant whale-eating raptorial whale. Both of these animals were from similar time periods, living throughout the Miocene and Pliocene, and coexisted for a few million years. At over 15 meters and 50 tons, the Livyatan holotype is slightly larger than a bull sperm whale. At nearly 16 meters and 61.5 tons, the recently described Otodus megalodon vertebrate column is also enormous. These 2 animals are 2 of the greatest apex predators to ever exist in Earth's history, but they have a new challenger on the block. The new monster isn't a mosasaur, the largest of which could reach 14.6 meters and 16 tons. It's also not a giant pliosaur like Ichthyosaurus, which maxed out at 11 meters and 13.5 tons. While formidable, those giant predators don't hold a candle to this new titan. For decades, the marine reptile group that our challenger belongs to has been constantly overlooked, with larger members of their kind being seen as either filter feeders or suction feeders. But new evidence shows that not only were they macropredatory, but far larger than anyone thought. Ichthyosaurs, or as some may call them, the sea dragons, were Triassic-Jurassic marine reptiles that resembled a terrifying mixture of whales and tuna. Their sleek, powerful bodies could cut through the water with their thuniform body plan, but also had a layer of blubber and were likely powered by a high active metabolism. In recent years, our knowledge of ichthyosaur body size and predatory behavior has blown apart what we thought to be their limits. For example, Shonisaurus popularis, a large late Triassic Shastasaurid which reached a length of 14 or 15 meters, with its skull around 3 meters long, or more accurately around 2.75 meters, weighed 17 to 26 tons. That's based on a mass estimate by researcher Darius Now, using a skeletal from Scott Hartman, though the upper end may be more likely. Shonisaurus was once thought to be toothless, but now a new redescription of 7 closely related skeletons in the Luning Formation in central Nevada by Kelly et al. 2022 has changed that. An article published in the Hakai magazine gives a good overview with comments from the authors. According to researcher Paige DiPolo, Shonisaurus has large, pointed teeth that are deeply rooted. The article further states that researchers now suspect that the ichthyosaur was an enormous predator, more akin to a whale-sized crocodile than a baleen whale. Neil P. Kelly, the lead author of the paper, hypothesizes that Shonisaurus was an opportunistic predator, crunching the shells of ammonites and feeding on other marine reptiles. In the actual paper, it describes how Shonisaurus fossilized remains include deep jaw fragments bearing large teeth with highly infolded roots set in distinct sockets. These are clearly large conical teeth, closer to railroad spikes than those from a peaceful giant. This updated skeletal reconstruction by Tasha Holman shows how this toothy ichthyosaur would actually look. The animal's sharp-toothed anatomy clearly implies that it was a predator of large prey, not a filter feeder or suction feeder. Several years before this paper was published, it was already hinted that Shonisaurus was a macropredator in the SVP abstract Kelly et al. 2016. The article states, "We located multiple dentigerous S. popularis jaws and isolated teeth in the field and existing collections, including a jaw in the display quarry. These fossils confirm the presence of teeth in all ontogenetic stages. These robust, occasionally carinate teeth set in individual sockets likely played a role in prey capture or processing, and indicate a macropredatory niche rather than filter or suction feeding. But it actually goes beyond that. Camp 1980 already showed that Shonisaurus popularis had teeth. The idea of macropredatory ichthyosaurs has seemingly been overlooked for decades due to long-standing assumptions in paleontology. Thanks to the widespread attitude that only mosasaurs and pliosaurs were macropredatory, it wasn't even considered that large ichthyosaurs could be too, despite the many pieces of fossil evidence to the contrary. Fortunately, that period seems to have ended. Another highly interesting tidbit of information from Kelly et al. 2022 is the explanation behind why these fossilized skeletons of Shonisaurus are grouped together. In an article published by the Smithsonian Magazine, it states, "Shonisaurus seems almost out of place where the majority of the fossils have been found. The problem is that there doesn't seem to be any prey large enough for such a carnivore in the same rocks other than Shonisaurus itself. I'm surprised by the lack of non-Shonisaurus remains at the locality, especially the apparent dearth of bony fishes," ichthyosaur researcher Aaron E. Maxwell says. Lacking evidence of cannibalism, therefore, the paleontologists proposed that Shonisaurus did their hunting and feeding elsewhere and deposited their babies in the warm, relatively predator-free waters of what eventually became Berlin. We infer Shonisaurus congregated close to what was then the Triassic coastline, even though it was fairly deep water, co-author Nicholas D. Piensen says. The pattern is similar to that of whales that travel to give birth in places like Monterey Bay, just in a different oceanic setting. If the paleontologist's migratory hypothesis is correct, then Shonisaurus returned to the same area time and again to give birth over a span of more than 100,000 years. Kelly stated, "The abundance of Shonisaurus in and around central Nevada might mean this place was special to the reptiles. Perhaps it was a place to mate, give birth, or migrate across. I like to imagine flying low and seeing hundreds of thousands of giant ichthyosaurs moving through. A river of thousands of macropredatory humpback whale-sized ichthyosaurs migrating to give birth in nurseries would likely strike fear into the heart of any Mesozoic animal. The close convergence of ichthyosaurs with modern cetaceans, including this mass periodic migration for birth, may lead one to think if this could be evidence of complex cetacean-like social behavior in ichthyosaurs. Well, the truth is we simply don't know. For example, basking sharks are solitary filter feeders but congregate in massive numbers for courtship, but that doesn't mean they have complex social behaviors or consistently travel in groups like cetaceans. However, for ichthyosaurs, it is a possibility. The paper states, "The results presented here underscore an additional behavioral trait that emerged early in ichthyosaur evolution, grouping behavior of adults. I don't think it matters that much, as any large prey item, including smaller ichthyosaurs, wouldn't probably care if the multiple giant macropredatory ichthyosaurs chasing them down were simply migrating towards a nursery or traveling in pods like cetaceans. They'd get ripped apart either way." Another enormous macropredatory ichthyosaur was the early Jurassic Temnodontosaurus, a genus composed of several species, with some well-preserved large specimens such as T. platydon and T. trigonodon reaching 9 to 10 meters in length, or around the same length as the largest bull orcas. In 2021, a near-complete enormous ichthyosaur skeleton was discovered in the UK and named the Rutland Sea Dragon, a 10.06-meter-long Temnodontosaurus specimen, possibly 5.15 tons. It had enormous eyes and a ring of scutes, bony plates to protect them from the water pressure during deep dives. There are also small vertebrae from that of a young ichthyosaur fossilized in its stomach. However, what people don't know is that some fragmentary remains suggest that Temnodontosaurus was significantly larger. In fact, the most fearsome predator of the Jurassic was likely an ichthyosaur, and not a pliosaur as many would think. Researcher Darius Now, using a more complete Temnodontosaurus trigonodon specimen, was able to scale 3 fragmentary remains which would belong to enormous specimens. Specimen BMNH481, based on a scapula, would be 13.9 meters and 13.6 tons, larger than the largest known T-Rex, Scotty. The other 2 specimens are even more enormous, and although some people were skeptical of these sizes, it is important to note that vertebrae scaling is one of the most accepted forms of scaling, if you have to scale from an isolated bone, as it varies the least from individual to individual and is a structure supporting part of the skeleton. Not only that, but Darius's colleague and supervisor, Dr. P. Martin Sander, works on ichthyosaurs. In fact, Darius is the one who was able to examine the new giant macropredatory ichthyosaur long before the paper regarding it was published, the one who held the enormous tooth in their hands in the intro of this video, so their credentials on this topic are certainly up to par. This is an appropriate time to give a big shout out to Darius, who's the reason that this video is being made in the first place. Specimen BMNH R266, based on an anterior caudal centrum, was 15 meters long and 17.2 tons, making it larger than a female sperm whale, which are around 11 meters and 15 tons in adult size. At 16.1 meters and 21.1 tons, the Temnodontosaurus specimen from Wenne 1922, based on an anterior caudal centrum, is utterly enormous, and comparable in mass to a medium-sized baleen whale. It's the same length as Megalodon and Livyatan, but significantly less massive with its elongated rostrum and less robust body. It's also important to note that the Temnodontosaurus GDI is still a work in progress that they might come back to at some point, so these figures could change in the meantime once more accurate measurements are done. Additionally, people think that due to the slender skull morphology of ichthyosaurs in general, even that of raptorial ones such as Temnodontosaurus, that they wouldn't be able to have powerful bites. But in fact, according to an article by the BBC, after using CT scanning and surface scanning on the skull of a Temnodontosaurus around 2 meters in length, they found that with its lever-like jaws in the posterior region where the most powerful bite is produced, it closed its jaws with over 30,000 newtons, or over 3 tons of force. That's already double that of a saltwater crocodile, which holds the record for the most powerful bite of any living animal. But imagine that devastating bite upscaled to a 16-meter Temnodontosaurus. If this 2-meter skull belonged to a Temnodontosaurus around 10 meters in length, then a maximum size 16.1 meter, 21.2 ton Temnodontosaurus would have a posterior bite force of 77,763 newtons, around 7.93 tons. That's 1.6 times more than the posterior bite force of a T-Rex, which is 48,505 newtons or 4.95 tons according to Sakamoto 2022, based on the specimen Stan. If the 2-meter skull belonged to a smaller Temnodontosaurus, perhaps 9.33 meters in length, then the posterior bite force of a 16.1 Temnodontosaurus would further increase to 89,268 newtons, or 9.1 tons. This has implications beyond just Temnodontosaurus, as it means that other macropredatory ichthyosaurs were also likely able to generate high bite forces, even with a relatively slender skull. One important thing to note is that Temnodontosaurus as a genus may be a wastebasket taxon composed of several different ichthyosaurs based on the differences in morphology and time between them, although this isn't confirmed. T. eurycephalus was 6 meters in length and had proportionally short and robust jaws with proportionally larger teeth compared to T. trigonodon and platydon, which had fairly long and slender teeth but still more robust jaws than those of non-raptorial ichthyosaurs. T. azerguensis had an unusually thin rostrum and was probably not as raptorial, better suited for taking on smaller prey. But before getting to the new ichthyosaur, a beast in the same tier as megalodon and Livyatan, we need to take a look at the predatory ichthyosaur we'll use to scale it. Imagine a marine hunter with a 9-foot skull and a body 2 to 3 times heavier than the largest mosasaurs. That's Himalayasaurus tibetensis. When it was discovered, there were only very fragmentary remains, such as a portion of its rostrum, teeth, some ribs, vertebrae, and portions from its flippers. Unlike many other ichthyosaurs, the late Triassic Himalayasaurus had laterally compressed teeth, which is significantly better suited for macropredation compared to conical teeth, but some paleontologists at the time wrote it off as not being a marine reptile, as they thought ichthyosaurs couldn't have evolved such dentition. In Motani et al. 1996, a redescription of Himalayasaurus was done where they confirmed a close relationship with Shastasaurus based on a radius bone. They also stated, Himalayasaurus was probably within the size range of Shonisaurus, assuming similar body proportions for the two closely related genera. The large size and extensive cutting edges of the teeth in H. tibetensis suggest that large vertebrates were probably among its prey items. Recently, a user named Changjing Ying created a skeletal reconstruction of Himalayasaurus based on the body proportions of other ichthyosaurs, and from a GDI it came out to an astonishing 35 tons at 15.6 meters in length. Its skull is clearly robust and built to take on large prey. The skulls and jaws of Shonisaurus popularis looks like a twig by comparison. This makes it nearly on par with Otodus megalodon and Livyatan, and essentially in the same tier as the other two Neogene titans. Mosasaurs up to 16 tons and giant pliosaurs at up to 13.5 tons don't even come close. With that information in mind, we could say that the big 3 largest and most powerful macropredators in history are 1. Otodus megalodon, 2. Livyatan melville, 3. Himalayasaurus tibetensis. But don't get too comfortable with that list, since it's going to change in about 3 seconds. Imagine something like Himalayasaurus, but bigger, on par with Otodus megalodon and Livyatan, an equal rival, a true challenger, in both size and ferocity to the two Neogene titans. The paper Sander et al. 2022, describing various fossilized ichthyosaur remains, teases a very fragmentary but clearly enormous macropredator, the one in the video's prologue. We'll call this new beast the Swiss Tyrant. An article published in The Guardian gives a good summary with additional comments from the authors. A fossil from one of the beasts was an incomplete tooth 10 centimeters in length, not associated with any vertebrae or other skeletal remains. The team found an enormous vertebra and rib fragments relating to another. The fossils of the third included 7 large vertebrae. Lead author Dr. P. Martin Sanders said none of the remains appeared to be known species of ichthyosaur. The team says that the tooth, which lacks most of its crown, is only the second to have come from a giant ichthyosaur, and is the largest ever found for such a creature, surpassing those of a species known as Himalayasaurus, which was discovered in China and is thought to have had a body length of about 15 meters. Ichthyosaurs have a very characteristic tooth structure that's visible in the root and also in the crown, said Sander, adding that the toothy giant discovered in the Alps probably would have eaten smaller ichthyosaurs and giant squid. Sander said one of the creatures appeared to have been about the same size as Himalayasaurus, while the other two, including the toothy beast, were probably similar in size to the giant ichthyosaur Shastasaurus, a creature found previously in British Columbia and that was about 21 meters long, around 2 double-decker bust lengths. That skeleton had vertebrae that are the same diameter as the ones from the Alps, said Sander. Until now, we have suspected that most of the largest ichthyosaurs were toothless and were suction feeders, he said, adding that the size of the newly reported tooth was stunning. The owner of this tooth was not to be messed with, said paleontologist Dr. Nick Fraser. Along with remains of vertebrae and ribs, here is really concrete evidence that, in the past, Triassic waters sheltered some truly massive ocean-going reptiles. End quote. Although the other fragmentary ichthyosaurs in the paper are interesting, we'll focus on specimen PIMUZA 3670, the giant isolated ichthyosaur tooth comparable in diameter to that of a large theropod. So how do we scale this from just a tooth alone? Unlike in more conserved animals such as sharks, there is huge uncertainty when it comes to scaling teeth from reptiles. However, there is a method to do so. In this case, since the crown is broken, we can't use the length of the tooth to extrapolate a size. Out of the 5 measurements given, maximum crown diameter seems to be the best choice, and is somewhat similar to an accurate tooth sizing method used for Otodus megalodon. Himalayasaurus tibetensis specimen IVPP V4301, the 15.6 meter and 35 ton holotype we talked about earlier, has a maximum crown diameter of 39.5 millimeters. By comparison, the late Triassic Swiss Tyrant has a maximum crown diameter of 46 millimeters, and we can simply use linear scaling through division and multiplying the total length of Himalayasaurus for a mass estimate, then upscaling that isometrically to find the mass. This would suggest that the Swiss Tyrant was 18.17 meters in length, and an astounding 55.3 tons in mass, surpassing that of a mature bull sperm whale of 16 meters and 45 tons, and essentially the same size as Megalodon and Livyatan. Since it's difficult to visualize the size difference by just talking about numbers, here's a size comparison of the two teeth from the supplementary paper, with the Himalayasaurus on the left and the Swiss Tyrant tooth on the right. Since I'm not an ichthyosaur expert or professional paleontologist, I reached out to researcher Darius Now in order to get further information and confirmation. Here's the quote. "Hi, your figures align pretty well with my own rough estimates for the specimen. As I hinted, I do not think this tooth should reasonably be taken as evidence of a blue whale-sized animal. It's in my opinion more likely that this was a very large, but not blue whale-sized ichthyosaur with relatively large macrophagous dentition. However, of course, that is a hypothesis, and depending on the analog and the tooth position, you could potentially get such a wide range of estimates that it is almost meaningless to give a size estimate. If I had to make a choice, Himalayasaurus, of course quite fragmentary itself, is likely the best analog, as it is the closest in tooth size and also fairly close stratigraphically, as opposed to, example given, Cymbospondylus. It's pretty validating to know that the extrapolated figures come out close to that of professional paleontologists, and that the analog of bulkier Himalayasaurus would also be the best choice to use for scaling, rather than a more slender analog. When further questioned on the method used to get an approximate size of the Swiss Tyrant, Darius stated, "I also used crown diameter and comparison with Himalayasaurus, so my estimate would be identical to yours. Although, as I was not trying to propose a serious estimate, merely prophylactically dispel myths that this thing was some sort of blue whale-sized behemoth, I never reported it precisely. I agree, however, that the most reliable approach is to compare multiple measurements." If we use the total height of the tooth, which is estimated rather than any actual measurement, we get a length estimate of 18.18 meters. We can't use crown height since the tooth crown is broken off. Root height would give an estimate of 19.15 meters, and root diameter using the smaller root measurement would give a mind-boggling 23.92 meters. However, this is almost certainly a very large overestimate. Tooth height is estimated and thus probably not that exact, although it's very close, and the root diameter is quite variable, as the roots of teeth are generally more variable than the crowns of teeth. It seems safer to go with an estimate of 18.17 meters rather than risk overestimating the size, as the maximum crown diameter likely would vary the least compared to the other measurements given. Dr. Martin Sander did guesstimate this tooth to come from an S. siccaniensis-sized animal, so technically it could be even larger, but then again, S. siccaniensis may be only 18.5 meters in length, which is close to the maximum crown diameter estimate anyways. The tooth is conical in shape in comparison to the lateral compression of Himalayasaurus, so does that mean it was less macropredatory? Macropredatory ichthyosaurs exist on a spectrum, some with more adaptations than others, such as proportionally larger or more robust jaws, or laterally compressed teeth and cutting edges. However, what may surprise some is that such adaptations are not necessary for macropredation in ichthyosaurs. Even ones that don't have those specific adaptations may indeed turn out to be successful macropredators. In the article Zhang et al. 2020, it states, "In the absence of direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, such as body size and tooth shape, has been used to infer the diet of fossil marine reptiles. If a large species has large teeth with carinae, cutting edges, it is usually considered the apex predator of its ecosystem even in the absence of a direct record of its diet. However, it is also known that not all marine apex predators have teeth with carinae. Example given, the killer whale and Temnodontosaurus trigonodon. Ichthyosaurus is a genus of ichthyosaur that would not be considered an apex predator based on the traditional criteria. Its typical size range is around 46 meters in total length, being smaller than the killer whale, Orcanis orca, although some individuals reached about 7 meters. Its teeth lacked carinae, and were not very large for the body size. However, in 2010, a nearly complete skeleton of Ichthyosaurus that directly contradicts this interpretation was excavated from the Lydian, Middle Triassic, in China. Inside the stomach of the 4.8 meter long Ichthyosaurus, they found the body of a thalattosaur, approximately 4 meters in length with a missing tail and head, likely severed by that of the ichthyosaur before swallowing it. The tail was found 23 meters away. The vertebral column of the thalattosaur is broken into strings, showing the ichthyosaur had a high bite force and possibly swallowed it in 1 to 4 pieces. As described earlier, 3 characteristics of the dentition suggest that the Ichthyosaurus specimen belonged to the smash feeding guild, whose members prey on soft cephalopods. In contrast, the bromelite reveals that its diet included large marine reptiles. Basically, to understand how crazy this would be the equivalent of a 16-meter, 45-ton sperm whale, which you'd expect to eat giant squid and the occasional small shark, to end up killing and eating an 8-meter, 6-ton orca and fully ingesting it. Another interesting case they discuss is Basanosaurus, considered a cephalopod feeder with a small skull, teeth, and a slender snout. The type specimen has a small ichthyosaur vertebrae inside of it, and it may not be from that of an embryo or its baby as previously thought, but rather another smaller ichthyosaur, as the centra are too well developed for that of an embryo and more characteristic of an adult's. They conclude with this: therefore, there may have been more megapredators with grasping teeth than currently recognized. Candidates include 2 ichthyosaur genera from the Illyrian, the Anisian of the Middle Triassic, with grasping teeth and slightly larger body sizes than Ichthyosaurus, Basanosaurus, a monotypic genus that belongs to Shastasauridae, as does Ichthyosaurus, and Cymbospondylus. So ichthyosaurs that were not previously thought to be macropredators may actually have been so. But the Swiss Tyrant is no grasper, even though its teeth are conical. It certainly was a true macropredator in every sense of the word, with adaptations to take on large prey, including deeply rooted teeth for handling high stresses when puncturing prey items, and it could likely take on prehistoric prey even larger than modern orcas. The diameter of its teeth rival that of T-Rex and giant pliosaurs, which is pretty impressive. However, it's not like ichthyosaurs only have their jaws and teeth as offensive weapons. Figure 1 in Pardo Perez et al. 2020 shows fossilized pathological wounds and injuries from various ichthyosaurs from the Triassic and Jurassic. The paper states, traumatic injuries to the ribs and gastralia are conspicuously absent in the Bassano Formation specimens, whereas they occur much more frequently in post-Triassic ichthyosaur assemblages. Such healed rib fractures are often interpreted as products of intraspecific aggression, and like bite traces found on the jaws of Cymbospondylus, Shastasaurus, and Mixosaurids, probably resulted from aggressive encounters with conspecifics, as has been hypothesized for other ichthyosaurs. Extant odontocete cetaceans also employ biting, as well as body slamming, high-velocity ramming, and tail strikes during aggressive interactions. These behaviors can result in broken ribs or even death, and are enabled by the powerful tail fin, which concentrates axial displacement in the caudal peduncle and is characteristic of a fusiform body plan. Imagine an enormous 18-meter, 55-ton Swiss Tyrant ramming itself into another similarly sized Swiss Tyrant Ichthyosaur in a dispute over food or territory or mating rights. The immense force concentrated on the tip of the rostrum would crack ribs and possibly be fatal. We can see that the Swiss Tyrant was an extremely formidable animal, a Mesozoic reptilian equivalent of Livyatan and Megalodon. However, there are some very important things to note regarding the size extrapolation of 18 meters and 55 tons. This is based off of Himalayasaurus tibetensis, which is already a very fragmentary animal. When the creator of the recent Himalayasaurus skeletal, Zhang Jingyin, was asked about whether they were confident in the weight estimate, they stated, "I'm not entirely certain, and the estimation provided here may be somewhat overestimated. However, considering the robustness in the lateral view is comparable with the 3D model of Temnodontosaurus, it could still weigh around 30 tons at this length. If 30 tons were used instead, then the Swiss Tyrant would be 47.4 tons at 18.17 meters in length, which is still larger than a bull sperm whale and close to that of Livyatan. Personally, I'd stick to the original estimation of 35 tons, as the author accounted for the gastralia and it was likely bulkier than Temnodontosaurus, with a more robust body needed to support its massive skull. But there's still great uncertainty regarding the Swiss Tyrant. It's not a 100% accurate size estimation, and significantly less certain than the 15 to 16 meter and 50 to 60 tons estimated for Megalodon and Livyatan due to its highly fragmentary nature. The exact position of the tooth is unknown, as well as the proportional size of teeth to body length. The bulk of the animal is also unknown among multiple other things, which could significantly end up changing the extrapolated size. That being said, it was certainly a very large macropredatory ichthyosaur, considering it has the biggest tooth of any ichthyosaur found so far. What about another recent headliner ichthyosaur? Cymbospondylus was a basal ichthyosaur genus from the early to middle Triassic, and a few years ago was commonly overlooked as being a formidable predator, as the discovered specimens at the time were large, but not even close to the big Shastasaurids. However, when it was revealed in 2021 that the specimen Jim 2 was none other than a species of Cymbospondylus, many people were quite surprised. The paper Sander et al. 2021 describes this extraordinary find, with a skull nearly 2 meters long and based on a humerus. It would have been around 17.65 meters in length and 44.7 tons, making it comparable in mass to living cetaceans. Interestingly, this fast growth would mean that ichthyosaurs reached larger body sizes much faster than cetaceans, though they peaked somewhat early. Interestingly, even with varying mass estimates, the Middle Triassic marine food webs were able to support several large-bodied ichthyosaurs at high trophic levels. However, the very high body mass is a bit questionable, considering the slender body shape of Cymbospondylus youngorum, and it turns out that's because they were simply scaled from a known GDI of Shonisaurus popularis up to the length of Cymbospondylus youngorum, even though Shonisaurus was significantly bulkier. Marcus Buehler, author of the Beastarium blog, neatly illustrated this with a size comparison between a bull sperm whale, which would weigh around 45 tons, and Cymbospondylus youngorum, supposedly around the same mass. But clearly this doesn't seem right, as the ichthyosaur is much less bulky. A knowledgeable skeletal artist, Chang Jingyin, stated that if you calculate the body mass based on Chaosaurus and Otodus 3D models which have similar robustness to Cymbospondylus, you could only get a 17 to 22 tons Cymbospondylus youngorum at 17.6 meters. Basically, this species of Cymbospondylus was huge, but only less than half the weight reported in the scientific paper, at around 19.5 tons. This still makes it absolutely enormous, and nearly double the weight of the largest bull orcas. But once again, things are not as simple as they initially seem. Paleo artist Fabio Alejandro's reconstruction of Cymbospondylus is around 15 meters rather than the 17.65 meters given in the paper, based on the length of central vertebrae and comparing it to that of other Cymbospondylus. That downsizes it further and gives a lower mass estimate if this reconstruction turns out to be accurate. As it is sometimes in paleontology, certain animals can be prone to hype, and giant ichthyosaurs are certainly no exception as seen in the previous example. S. sicaniensis, another large Shastasaurid from Middle to Late Triassic, is often claimed as being comparable in size to a very large whale, with an estimate of up to 21 meters and 81.5 tons according to Sandra et al. 2021. However, this is an overestimation of its true mass, as in the paper they simply scaled up S. popularis, but S. popularis has significantly longer ribs of 3 meters versus the 1.9 meters in S. sicaniensis, and a deeper body than many other ichthyosaurs. Darius now used a better base model to extrapolate a mass estimate, using a 3D model of Ichthyosaurus tangae and scaling it to S. sicaniensis. This gave a more accurate mass estimate of 34.56 tons. Another independent size estimation came from Cytology Hub, who used several regressions from modern rorquals as they had a similar slenderness, and manipulated the girth and length to match that of a Shastasaurid. Their mass estimate is surprisingly close to that of Darius, with a 21-meter S. sicaniensis being around 26 to 34 tons. To complicate things more, paleo artist Fabio Alejandro's extensive reconstruction of S. sicaniensis gave a more conservative length of around 18.5 meters. However, researcher Darius now stated, this is a rough estimate of course, but 30 to 40 tons for S. sicaniensis seems quite likely for the specimen, irrespective of whether it is 21 or 18 meters. Also, similar to Basanosaurus for a given length. A 34-ton S. sicaniensis is large, but not on the same level as a Otodus megalodon or Livyatan, let alone a large whale. That's not even getting into the fact we don't have any idea about its ecology, which is also a similar problem with another 2 giant fragmentary specimens we have. In 2018, headlines were made when 2 serangulars from enormous ichthyosaurs were described in Lomax et al., one named the Lilstock Monster specimen at 26 meters in length, and the other the Aust Colossus, being 30% or more larger than that of Lilstock. They are certainly very large, even if highly fragmentary, but how large exactly? In an article by the lead author, it is stated it's very difficult to accurately estimate the animal's size because we only have a large piece of its jaw, but we do know that the Lilstock fossil is about 25% larger than the same bone in S. sicaniensis. So using a simple scaling factor, we can estimate that our ichthyosaur was up to 26 meters long. Comparing it with other Shastasaurid ichthyosaurs suggested it was between 20 meters and 25 meters in length. So it seems using S. sicaniensis gives a larger size estimate, assuming the initial 21 meter length is correct. But even when using related Shastasaurid ichthyosaurs, the range varies by 5 meters. And technically, if the mean of this range is correct, it would be 22.5 meters in length. But what about the mass and upscaling from other ichthyosaurs? S. popularis and S. sicaniensis, as of now, are both considered Shastasaurids, and are both in the same family of Shastasauridae, but their bulk is significantly different from one another. Essentially, Shastasaurids vary significantly in mass and tend to be more slender in shape. Using one of the bulkiest ichthyosaurs might not be the best way to get a true estimation of its size. Cytology Hub estimated the Lilstock Shastasaurid at 26 meters and 49 to 64 tons, and the Aust Colossus, assuming a 40% scaling, at 30.8 meters and 78 to 105 tons. The Lilstock Monster would be around the size of a Otodus megalodon and Livyatan, whereas the Aust Colossus may have been as large as a fin whale. Darius more rigorously calculated that based on Basanosaurus and scaling up. The Lilstock Monster would be 21.4 meters and 39.6 tons. Assuming a more liberal scaling of 50% for the Aust Colossus, this would give an estimate of 32.1 meters and 133 tons. It's important to note that Darius stated that they used the maximum ratios from the figures reported by Lomax et al. For both of the specimens, so in that regard these do not represent lower bound estimates either. The mean estimate of scaling by 40% would give a mean size around 30 meters and 108 tons, which is near identical to the method used by Cytology Hub. So what about the idea that Essiconiensis, the Lilstock Monster, or Aust Colossus were macropredators even larger than megalodon? While it's unlikely that Essiconiensis or the Lilstock Monster were quite in the same category of mass, the Aust Colossus was likely over 100 tons, based on current calculations as we just discussed. Given the fragmentary nature of these specimens, however, no estimate is solid, and we can't confidently say anything about the ecology of these animals. Without preserved teeth, we don't know if they were filter feeders, suction feeders, or macropredators, and we can only hope that more material will be discovered. With those disclaimers taken into account and these smaller estimates for the Lilstock Monster and Aust Colossus, we should recognize that we simply don't know how big these animals were. The fact that the absolute minimum estimates put the Aust Colossus at nearly 80 tons is insane, and it was likely far larger than that. It's entirely possible that it was proportionally more bulky, but we need more information to confidently say anything about the animal. Shastasaurs vary significantly in bulkiness and jaw morphology, which can heavily impact these estimates. This means that there's great uncertainty regarding their size and mass compared to the two Neogene titans. However, there is a way to test whether these two were macropredators or not, and that would be through nitrogen testing, similar to Costatal 2022, which analyzed nitrogen levels in Otodus megalodon teeth to determine their place in the predatory hierarchy. For the giant ichthyosaurs, this would look like isotope testing on the preserved serangulars, giving a better idea of how high up they were on the food chain. There is a good chance that they were macropredators and occupied a high trophic level, especially with recent evidence indicating similar behavior in Shastasaurus, but that's just a guess. Dr. Dean Lomax, who led the original 2018 study that brought us our first tidbits of information about these colossi, has promised that another description of the giant ichthyosaur material is coming soon. Stay tuned on this channel for coverage of those updates. There are also gigantic, unpublished giant ichthyosaur specimens. However, it's not known if they're macropredatory or not, as the current fossil evidence is too fragmentary. Martin et al. 2015 describes a large fragmentary radius of a Shastasaur from the lowermost Jurassic, estimated to be 12 to 15 meters in length, or nearly the same length as Shonisaurus popularis. There is also a supposed enormous lost ichthyosaur centrum comparable to that of a sauropod, but the outdated nature of the original description, unusual central length to width ratio, and unclear measurement of this possible specimen makes it very unlikely that it was truly that size. Also, in the original paper describing Essiconiensis, Nichols and Manabey 2004, they state, "In the field, this specimen measured 21 meters in length, although isolated elements from other localities indicate that larger individuals existed." However, as of the time of this video, nearly 2 decades have passed since the paper's publication, and no formal description has been produced of said elements. Put it on your Christmas list. I'm sure that they exist, but it would be better if they were officially described so we could get a reliable estimate of how large Essiconiensis could truly get. Also, for ichthyosaurs such as the Welsh giant in Martin et al. 2015, and similar giants where there isn't fossil evidence for macropredation due to being too fragmentary, nitrogen testing or other similar trophic level testing would help narrow down whether these ichthyosaurs were macropredators or not. And what would a marine reptile cinematic universe video be without a post-credits scene? Here on the Vividen, we'll soon be covering another new species of macropredator surpassing all the ones that we've described in this video. This paper might just rewrite our understanding of the ancient ocean's power structure. But there's always a bigger fish. Further down the line, we'll be publishing an in-depth analysis of the most dangerous macropredator that's ever evolved on Earth, a beast that even surpasses the near-mythical Aust Colossus. The top 3 predators discussed in this video are firecrackers compared to the nuclear warhead that's approaching, so get into your bunkers, grab your food storage, and get your popcorn ready for an exclusive representing months of research and collaboration. The collective knowledge of countless people, scientific papers, fossils, and calculations never before seen, both fact and speculation, past and present, myth and legend, will be coming to you, right here on the Vividen. Thanks for watching! Subscribe to the Vividen and to Apexius for more paleontology updates. Feel free to check out the Ultimate Battles Discord server and Vividen subreddit with links in the description. Make sure to check back in a few months. Something huge will be dropping then, and you won't want to miss it. Also, big shout out to Apexius for being the driving research force behind this video. This is the first of multiple collabs, so don't forget to subscribe to both channels if you're a fan of high quality paleontology work. See you next time!